Germany, Europe's biggest economy, the Chancellor Olaf Scholz has called the new U.S. tariffs fundamentally wrong.
The U.S. auto industry just lost over $219 billion. The European Union froze all U.S.-made electric vehicle certifications. China cut off tech access and production rights. Ford, GM, and Tesla are in crisis mode. Dealerships nationwide are seeing mass cancellations. Lawmakers are calling it a foreign takedown. And Canada just sided with Europe, ending decades of trade unity. This is not a slowdown. It is a full-blown economic shutdown. So how did America's most powerful industry collapse overnight? And who really benefits from the chaos? What's happening? Nobody expected the first strike to come from Germany, the very heart of Europe's auto industry. But that is exactly what happened when Berlin announced an immediate freeze on electric vehicle certifications for all U.S. manufactured vehicles. This policy wasn't temporary. It was enacted under sweeping new tech compliance and transparency laws passed by Germany's Ministry of Digital Infrastructure and Transport. These new laws give the German government full authority to reject any vehicle that does not meet their rigorous software, battery tracking, and sustainability verification standards. And at the top of their rejection list, Tesla, Ford, and General Motors. The impact was instant and brutal. Tesla's Model Y shipments were denied entry at the port of Bremerhaven. Ford's electric Explorer, manufactured in the United States for European markets, was flagged for audit before it even reached dealerships. General Motors' plans to re-enter Europe with its new Ultium battery platform were put on indefinite hold. German regulators cited insufficient data sovereignty protocols and unverified supply chain emissions as justification. But make no mistake, this was economic warfare under the banner of environmental and digital ethics. For American automakers, Germany's move wasn't just a trade restriction. It was a reputational death blow. Germany is not just another car market. It is the gateway to the entire European Union. If your vehicles can't be certified there, you're effectively locked out of the entire European economic area. That's over 440 million consumers suddenly off limits to Detroit's biggest names. Elon Musk was said to be personally furious, and multiple auto executives reportedly begged the U.S. State Department for intervention. But none came. Germany defended the freeze by pointing to a rising global need for technological integrity and supply chain transparency, which, translated from diplomat speak, meant we no longer trust American compliance standards under President Trump. It was the first time a close U.S. ally had publicly severed industrial trust at this scale, and it set the stage for something far worse. As Germany drew its line in the sand, France was already preparing to launch a strike of its own, this time not against certification, but against the very pricing model of the American auto industry. If you're not subscribed yet, now's the time. This story is only getting bigger. Hit subscribe and stay ahead of the chaos. France's environmental laws crush USSUVS. This is a country that has never been subtle when it comes to environmental activism, but the country's latest policy shift makes its earlier carbon regulations look like polite suggestions. Under the leadership of France's newly emboldened climate ministry, Paris passed an ultra-aggressive carbon taxation law targeting imported vehicles based on weight, emissions, and fuel consumption history, and who just happens to build some of the heaviest, thirstiest vehicles on the market: U.S. automakers. Effective immediately, the new law imposes a tiered tax on vehicles with curb weights over 4,000 pounds and engine outputs exceeding 300 horsepower. That's nearly every truck and SUV made by American manufacturers. The Ford F-Series, Chevrolet Tahoe, Dodge Durango, and even electric models like the Hummer EV were all penalized. France doesn't care if your SUV is gas or electric. It cares if it's big, heavy, and difficult to recycle. The policy includes a one-time import tax and an annual registration penalty for these vehicles, making them effectively unaffordable for middle-class French consumers. The real kicker: France did not apply this law to its own domestically produced vehicles. Peugeot, Renault, and even certain luxury Citroën models were granted full exemptions under sustainable manufacturing waivers. The message was crystal clear: American-made vehicles are the problem, and French-made ones are the solution. U.S. automakers and trade representatives called it blatant protectionism. France called it carbon realism. Within 72 hours of the law's enactment, multiple French dealerships canceled contracts to import American trucks and SUVs. Dealerships feared they couldn't sell them at a profit under the new tax regime. At least 7 U.S. manufacturers had models pulled from online sales platforms overnight. And just like that, France had effectively shut down an entire segment of American exports without banning them outright. While France's carbon crackdown targeted the American love affair with oversized vehicles, the next European country to strike would go after something even more dangerous to U.S. interests: electric vehicle subsidies. Denmark ends tax credits for Tesla and Ford. In a stunning policy move, the Danish Ministry of Taxation introduced a sweeping new national EV credit framework that excluded every American-made vehicle. Under the new rules, only vehicles produced within the European Union or those certified under EU Green Label guidelines could receive Denmark's generous tax benefits for electric vehicle purchases. That meant no credits for Tesla, no credits for Ford's Mustang Mach-E, and no support for any Detroit EV not built on European soil. This wasn't a symbolic move. Danish EV buyers had come to rely on these credits, which reduced the purchase price of eligible vehicles by up to 15%. Removing U.S. models from eligibility effectively made them non-competitive overnight. Within a week, Tesla's online configurator in Denmark was showing price increases of more than $8,000 for base trims. Ford's sales office in Copenhagen saw a 68% drop in website traffic following the announcement. Denmark didn't just end the credits, it actively promoted alternatives. State-funded advertising campaigns now encourage citizens to buy French, German, and Swedish EVs instead. The Danish Energy Agency went so far as to publish a list of preferred green partners, none of which included a single American brand. Tesla Denmark staff called it a chilling message. Ford dealers called it deliberate isolation. American officials called it an act of policy aggression. And still, Denmark doubled down. Officials cited misalignments in environmental accountability metrics and incompatibility with EU data exchange systems as reasons for the exclusion. But analysts saw it differently. They saw it as punishment for President Trump's growing hostility toward multilateral trade rules, and as an early sign of European unity against U.S. economic dominance. That unity would become unmistakable in the following days, when a North American ally stunned the world by siding with Europe, not with its southern neighbor. Mark Carney's alliance. Canada joins Europe's trade bloc. When Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney stood at the podium in Paris beside President Emmanuel Macron and German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, the world realized the trade map was being redrawn in real time. In a move that stunned Washington and delighted Brussels, Carney signed the Green Technology Access Partnership, a trilateral agreement that binds Canada's auto tech certification, climate data policies, and EV manufacturing subsidies to those of the European Union. This agreement effectively ties Canada to European EV regulation, meaning that if your product fails in Berlin or Paris, it will now likely fail in Toronto and Vancouver too. For the United States, this is a nightmare. It means American automakers not only face a hostile European market, but now also a Canadian government that is aligning itself with European compliance structures. Prime Minister Carney justified the move as a new chapter in democratic sustainability, but the political undertones were impossible to ignore. Since returning to power, President Trump had sidelined Canada in key trade talks, dismantled elements of the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement, and repeatedly insulted Carney's environmental credentials. This was payback, and it was strategic. The alliance includes cooperative battery recycling initiatives, real-time emissions data sharing, and joint industrial compliance inspections for EV imports. Translation: U.S. automakers will be forced to meet European-style standards to sell into Canada, standards they currently do not meet. What's worse, Canadian ports are now offering preferential processing for European EVs, while U.S. exports face longer inspections and enhanced scrutiny. Detroit auto firms, already reeling from Europe's crackdown, now find their northern neighbor mirroring those very policies. Elon Musk reportedly canceled a planned visit to Ottawa. Ford lobbied the White House for immediate retaliation. And Trump, he fumed on Truth Social, calling Carney a traitor to the West. As Canada links arms with Europe and Trump fumes from Washington, the economic fallout is about to get worse, because Wall Street is watching and it is not impressed. U.S. auto stocks crash on tech compliance crisis. Wall Street rarely reacts well to regulatory uncertainty, but what happened after Europe began rejecting American electric vehicles was not just a market correction, it was a full-blown investor panic. The trigger was Germany's public declaration that U.S. vehicles failed to meet new tech compliance standards, particularly in areas of battery material tracing, emissions data integration, and cross-border software protocols. That might sound like bureaucratic jargon, but to investors, it meant something much simpler: massive sunk costs with no market access. The electric vehicle sector on the New York Stock Exchange took an immediate nosedive. Within 24 hours of Germany's certification freeze, Tesla's stock price dropped nearly 11%. Ford and General Motors weren't far behind, shedding nearly 9% and 7% respectively. Lucid Motors, Rivian, and other smaller EV startups saw double-digit percentage losses as investors pulled out, fearing cascading bans across other European markets. More than $100 billion in market value evaporated within 3 days. What triggered the steepest declines wasn't the loss of vehicle sales alone, it was the exposure of a deeper problem. American companies had built their electric platforms around US-centric standards, assuming that the rest of the world would eventually follow. Europe's rejection proved the opposite. The United States was now the one out of sync. Investors realized that automakers would have to completely retool their battery sourcing, vehicle software, and data-sharing frameworks to access Europe, if they were ever allowed back in. This realization sent analysts scrambling to revise earnings forecasts. JP Morgan downgraded Tesla and General Motors to underweight. Goldman Sachs published a note titled "Unacceptable Risk Exposure in EV Exports." And retail investors, many of whom had bet their portfolios on the EV boom, began mass sell-offs. But the worst was yet to come, because the real money wasn't just in vehicle sales. It was in Tesla's massive European infrastructure ambitions, and those were about to go dark. Tesla's $31.4 billion European pipeline goes dark. Electric vehicle dominance in Europe was never just about selling cars. It was about shaping the continent's technological backbone. Tesla knows this. Over the last 4 years, the company had quietly secured over $31 billion in public-private partnerships, green tech subsidies, and infrastructure bonds across Europe. Gigafactory Berlin was supposed to be the crown jewel, a sprawling nerve center for European EV production, battery development, and AI-driven manufacturing. But after Germany's tech compliance freeze, and amid rising distrust of US-based corporate governance, that pipeline was instantly severed. European investment banks led the charge. BNP Paribas, Deutsche Bank, and the European Investment Bank all announced that they were reassessing their exposure to Tesla-related projects. Within days, funds earmarked for gigafactory expansion, software hubs in France, and battery research grants in the Netherlands were frozen. Applications under review were paused. Disbursements scheduled for Q2 were postponed indefinitely. For Tesla, this wasn't just a cash flow issue. It was a reputational crisis. European governments began openly questioning Tesla's compliance with labor, transparency, and digital integrity laws. Regulators in Brussels leaked memos alleging serious inconsistencies in Tesla's recycling claims and supply chain disclosures. French lawmakers demanded an audit of Tesla's tax incentives. Germany's finance ministry went a step further, calling for a complete suspension of subsidies to any entity that fails sovereignty criteria. Tesla was no longer treated as a partner. It was treated as a risk. Elon Musk remained publicly silent for days, a rare move from the normally combative CEO. Internally, sources reported panic. Engineers were told to pause new facility work across Europe. Legal teams began preparing for a multi-country compliance review. Executives were forced to reroute logistics around suddenly frozen supply lanes. The financial shock was so severe that it rippled back to Tesla's U.S. operations. Hiring freezes were implemented at multiple locations. R&D spending was slashed. Several major suppliers, dependent on Tesla's European projects, warned of layoffs. Tesla's European ambitions didn't just dim, they collapsed, and the company that had once been Europe's EV darling now found itself under siege across the continent. And while Tesla scrambled for damage control, American legacy automakers were about to be hit with something even worse: physical seizures of their shipments on European soil. Detroit's EV exports seized in port raids. The world watched in disbelief as European customs officials executed one of the most aggressive enforcement campaigns in recent automotive history. In a matter of hours, authorities at the ports of Hamburg and Marseille began seizing American-made electric vehicles, thousands of them. Ford's new electric Explorer, General Motors' Ultium-based SUVs, and even Lucid Air sedans were pulled from cargo vessels and placed into impound warehouses pending regulatory review. The raids were not symbolic. They were coordinated, targeted, and explicitly framed as enforcement of new emissions transparency laws and digital compliance standards. Customs officials stated that the U.S.-made vehicles failed to meet criteria under the European Vehicle Integrity Framework, particularly around traceability of battery minerals, emissions certification from third-party labs, and real-time software audit protocols. The visual of thousands of American vehicles lined up in detention yards, surrounded by armed customs agents and inspection drones, spread like wildfire across global media. News anchors compared the scenes to Cold War-era trade seizures. Social media was flooded with footage of German and French officials scanning vehicle VINs and applying seizure stickers to windshields. One video of a brand new Ford Mustang Mach-E being loaded off a ship only to be turned away at the docks racked up millions of views within hours. American companies were blindsided. Ford released a furious press statement condemning the seizures as unjustified and politically motivated. General Motors said it had fully complied with all known regulations. Lucid Motors threatened legal action in the European Court of Justice, but the shipments remained frozen. The message from European leaders was unambiguous. Compliance is not optional, and no amount of lobbying will override public trust or digital transparency. More than 12,000 American electric vehicles were seized or delayed within the first week alone. Dozens of dealership contracts were canceled. European importers began demanding indemnity clauses in new agreements, fearing future seizures. The Port of Antwerp even began denying docking clearance to certain U.S. vessels preemptively. And just as American companies scrambled to understand how their export channels had been crushed overnight, a new explosion hit the geopolitical stage. This time, not from Europe, but from the White House. Trump blames Mark Carney, threatens retaliation. The silence from Washington didn't last long. Within hours of the port raids becoming global news, President Donald Trump took to his platform on Truth Social and unleashed a political firestorm. In a series of all-caps posts, Trump blamed Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney directly for what he called the greatest betrayal in auto trade history. Trump accused Carney of selling out the American worker to European globalists and destroying North American manufacturing unity. But he didn't stop at rhetoric. Speaking at an emergency press conference from the White House, Trump announced that his administration was preparing immediate retaliatory tariffs against Canadian auto exports. Specifically, he threatened a 25% levy on all Canadian-manufactured electric vehicles, auto components, and lithium battery modules entering the United States. The threat sent shockwaves through markets, already shaken by the European clampdown. Canada's response was swift but measured. Prime Minister Carney addressed the nation in a televised speech, calling Trump's statements a distraction from deeper regulatory failings. He defended the European partnership, arguing that Canada's auto future depends on global credibility and environmental accountability. But behind the scenes, Canadian trade officials were reportedly preparing emergency legal filings and WTO escalation plans. Trump's threats didn't end with Canada. He hinted at retaliatory tariffs on German and French luxury cars, suggesting a blanket 20% import tax on all EU vehicle brands. Analysts feared an escalating trade war that could drag the entire global auto market into chaos. Industry groups were horrified. The American Automotive Export Council warned that retaliatory tariffs could cost over 150,000 U.S. jobs. U.S. dealerships with Canadian and European partners pleaded with the administration to de-escalate. Meanwhile, union leaders who had previously backed Trump began expressing concern over rising tensions and collapsing overseas sales. But for Trump, this was personal. His administration saw Carney's alliance with Europe as a direct challenge to U.S. sovereignty, and in Trump's worldview, such a challenge demanded forceful retribution. As the dust settled from Trump's announcement, the world was left staring at a fractured auto alliance, a collapsing EV supply chain, and the real possibility of an economic war between longtime allies. And just as Trump prepared to escalate even further, the next blow came not through embassies, but through pocketbooks, targeting the very segment of U.S. automakers that had once been untouchable. Tesla crushed in Europe's luxury tax spiral. Europe's high-end electric vehicle market has been dominated by one company for a very long time now. Tesla's Model S, Model X, and higher trims of the Model Y and Model 3 were synonymous with innovation and affluence in cities like Berlin, Paris, and Amsterdam. But that dominance came crashing down when Germany and France enacted a new round of coordinated luxury taxes aimed squarely at foreign electric vehicles, priced above $40,000. The timing was no coincidence. This was retaliation dressed in fiscal policy. Under the new guidelines, any non-European electric vehicle exceeding that price threshold would be hit with a combined surcharge of 15 to 25%, depending on size, weight, and country of origin. For Tesla, this was catastrophic. Nearly 80% of its European-bound units fell above that line. Overnight, Tesla's pricing advantage vanished, and premium customers began canceling orders en masse. French consumers who had pre-ordered the new dual-motor Model Y performance variant suddenly faced invoices inflated by nearly $9,000. In Germany, dealers scrambled to renegotiate contracts, but the damage was already done. Market analytics firms reported a drop of 36% in high-trim Tesla bookings within the first 2 weeks of the tax implementation. Elon Musk, blindsided by the coordinated attack, accused European governments of economic protectionism wrapped in green policy. But his criticism fell on deaf ears. The policy was crafted with surgical precision. European brands like Porsche, Audi, and BMW, many of which build their EVs within the continent, were spared or granted tax exemptions based on domestic supply chain contributions. American models, even if partially assembled in Europe, were not exempt. France's finance ministry justified the disparity by citing unverified life cycle carbon data from U.S. plants, while Germany claimed foreign software vulnerability risks as further cause. For Tesla, the loss of premium customers in Europe was more than a financial hit. It was a brand crisis. The company had cultivated an image of cutting-edge luxury. That image now came with a tariff. As sales plummeted, Tesla faced an even more devastating blow: the loss of its technological core. Europe bans U.S. self-driving software. In a move that drew gasps across Silicon Valley and Detroit alike, the European Commission announced a continent-wide ban on American-developed autonomous driving software. Brussels cited algorithmic sovereignty, data localization violations, and end-user telemetry privacy risks as justification. But everyone understood the real message. The era of American digital dominance in Europe was officially over. The ban targeted software suites developed by Tesla, Waymo, Cruise, and other US-based companies, rendering them ineligible for approval under the European Union's new AI governance laws. Officials claim the algorithms failed to comply with the European Union's requirements for transparent neural logic mapping, real-time data escrow, and interoperable emergency override controls. These standards had been in development for over 2 years, but the timing of the ban's rollout, right after Trump's diplomatic rupture, was no accident. Tesla was hit hardest. Its full self-driving beta software, which had been undergoing limited testing in Norway and the Netherlands, was abruptly ordered offline. Vehicles with the feature installed were forced to disable it remotely, sparking outrage among the owners who had paid thousands of dollars for the capability. Some European Tesla forums described the move as tech excommunication. The consequences were sweeping. American companies could no longer collect user behavior data from European roads. This data, once the crown jewel of machine learning development, was now off limits. It meant Tesla's artificial intelligence could not evolve using European driving patterns, road signage, or behavioral norms. It was as if the company had been digitally amputated from an entire continent's worth of machine learning input. Waymo's planned pilot program in Luxembourg was canceled. Cruise halted recruitment for its European operations, and investors began quietly shifting their focus toward European native software developers like Oxbotica and Mobileye, who suddenly found themselves uncontested in the region. With digital systems under attack and hardware taxed out of relevance, one thing became crystal clear. The global automotive balance of power was shifting away from the United States. Fast. U.S. auto execs testify in front of Congress. Capitol Hill was filled with tension and political theater as the chief executives of Ford, General Motors, and Tesla were summoned to testify before Congress. It was the kind of hearing that drew bipartisan outrage, a rare moment where both Republicans and Democrats demanded answers from an industry that once symbolized American dominance, but was now on life support. The hearing was triggered by the complete breakdown in trade relations between the United States and the European Union, and the mood inside the chamber was unmistakable: betrayal, confusion, and blame. Ford's chief executive was the first to take the hot seat. Clad in a dark suit and flanked by legal counsel, he tried to explain why Ford had failed to anticipate regulatory changes in Germany and France. Lawmakers were not buying it. One senator from Ohio thundered, "You are telling me that one of the most storied automakers in America didn't see this coming. Either you were asleep at the wheel, or you thought Congress wouldn't notice the crash." Next came General Motors, which found itself cornered over its failed European comeback strategy. Its much-hyped Ultium platform, touted as the future of EV manufacturing, had been designed without consideration for new digital compliance standards abroad. House members grilled the company for pouring billions into outdated partnerships that did not meet evolving European technical requirements. A representative from Michigan put it bluntly, "You invested in the wrong tech for the wrong market. Now our workers are paying the price." Then came the moment most had been waiting for. Elon Musk's testimony on behalf of Tesla. Dismissive and unbothered at first, Musk took questions with his trademark smirk, but the tone changed quickly. Members of Congress displayed documents revealing that Tesla had received early warnings from German regulatory bodies about data sovereignty non-compliance, and ignored them. "You gambled on your brand being too big to fail in Europe," one congresswoman said. Turns out Europe disagreed. As the testimonies unfolded, one truth became clear. None of the U.S. automakers were prepared for the European pivot. No strategy had been built for a post-cooperation world. The hearings revealed a staggering lack of foresight and a deeply rooted assumption that global markets would always revolve around American design and ambition. That illusion was shattered. While the automakers tried to explain themselves in Washington, European leaders were preparing to put the final nail in the coffin by redefining the global EV economy in their own image and locking the United States out entirely. Europe launches its own EV index, excludes US. Across the Atlantic in Frankfurt, a new financial weapon was unveiled with surgical precision. It was called the EVI 100, short for the European Vehicle Innovation 100. This new stock exchange index, backed by the European Central Bank and the European Investment Fund, would exclusively track 100 of Europe's top-performing electric vehicle and green mobility firms. Companies included ranged from legacy giants like Volkswagen and Stellantis to startups specializing in battery recycling, digital mapping, and hydrogen storage. There was just one caveat: no American companies allowed. This was not merely an investment tool, it was a statement of independence. For decades, Wall Street had been the global benchmark for automotive capital. Tesla, General Motors, and Ford had dominated investor portfolios worldwide. But now Europe was signaling that it would define its own path without U.S. involvement. European lawmakers framed the index as an act of industrial sovereignty, a way to insulate Europe's clean tech future from what they called foreign regulatory volatility. The EVY 100 received immediate backing from pension funds in Norway, sovereign wealth groups in the Gulf, and tech-driven funds from Singapore. Investors were drawn not only to its clean tech potential, but also to its ideological message. In less than 2 weeks, the EVI 100 pulled over $50 billion in capital away from Wall Street-linked EV indexes. Tesla's market cap dipped. Ford's institutional ownership dropped. General Motors saw its green bond sales dry up completely. The American exclusion from this index wasn't based on market performance. It was based on trust. Europe no longer trusted that the United States would remain a stable trade partner under the leadership of President Trump. Financial analysts called it the geopolitical pricing of risk. In other words, being American had become a liability in the global green economy. While investors migrated toward Europe's self-contained EV ecosystem, Tesla made a dramatic announcement that would alter its global footprint forever. Tesla leaves Europe, shifts to Southeast Asia. In a stunning turn, Tesla's leadership announced during a late-night investor call that it would immediately shut down all retail operations in Europe. The company would close its service centers in Germany, France, Denmark, and the Netherlands. All expansion plans for Eastern Europe were scrapped. The reason? Regulatory hostility, said Musk. We are not going to spend another dollar fighting governments that clearly do not want us there. Instead, Tesla announced a full pivot to Southeast Asia, with primary focus on Thailand, Vietnam, and India. These markets, Musk claimed, want Tesla, need Tesla, and understand Tesla. In preparation, the company is reportedly building a second gigafactory in Thailand and establishing new software compliance teams in Bengaluru and Ho Chi Minh City. On paper, the pivot made sense. Southeast Asia's rising middle class is EV hungry and infrastructure investment is booming, but critics questioned whether Tesla could recreate its European success in vastly different political and economic environments. India's complex bureaucracy, Vietnam's state-influenced industrial policies, and Thailand's recent swings in foreign investor rules all present challenges that the company has never navigated before. European governments responded to Tesla's exit with muted sarcasm. German officials wished Musk all the best with his new endeavors, while French newspapers called the decision a welcome simplification of the EV market. The European Union wasted no time reassigning Tesla's former market share to EU-based companies through rapid dealer incentives and digital loyalty programs. Tesla's departure marked more than a commercial withdrawal. It was the symbolic end of the United States leadership in the European EV revolution, with Europe building its own supply chains, indexes, and trade alliances. There was simply no place left for American brands, especially not those led by executives who treated regulation like a game. The fallout back home was brutal, and it came fast. American auto jobs vanish as global trust erodes. Detroit, Toledo, and parts of Kentucky and Missouri woke up to grim headlines. Massive layoffs across Ford, General Motors, and Tesla. In the span of just 3 weeks, more than 200,000 American auto jobs were lost. Plants that had previously been dedicated to European exports sat idle. Suppliers that once churned out parts for German-bound shipments now shuttered their doors. Small towns built around the promise of global trade were left in economic freefall. The job losses weren't limited to factory workers. Engineers, compliance officers, freight handlers, and even port-based customs specialists were let go in waves. Tech firms that had partnered with automakers to meet European software standards dissolved contracts overnight. Battery logistics companies lost major clients. The entire American EV export infrastructure was collapsing like a house of cards. And unlike previous downturns, this one couldn't be blamed on automation or consumer demand. It was the direct result of geopolitical isolation. Foreign regulators had made a conscious choice to remove the United States from their economic plans. They were building a future in which American-made vehicles were irrelevant and perhaps even undesirable. Union leaders pleaded with Washington for a coordinated federal response. But with Trump doubling down on retaliatory tariffs and isolationist trade policies, there was little hope for re-entry into the European sphere. Congressional debates raged, but no new legislation could undo the lost trust. Even domestic consumer sentiment began to sour, as Americans questioned how their own government had allowed the country's flagship industry to be exiled. Wall Street analysts issued rare "do not buy" advisories on all 3 major U.S. automakers. Foreign car makers began buying up abandoned dealership networks. And by the end of the quarter, it became clear. This was not a temporary slump. It was a total collapse of American auto influence on the world stage, with American EVs banned, delisted, and removed from Europe, and Canada joining the opposite side. The global trust that once powered U.S. auto dominance had not only eroded, it had been systematically replaced. The U.S. auto industry just got shut out, and the world moved on without it. What do you think? Was this sabotage or just a failure to adapt? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what happens next.